Morning. I'm Amrish Mehta from Gujarat, Baroda. I work with an organization called Arch Wine and currently working for FR issues in Gujarat.
Good morning. I'm Nidhi Srivastav. I'm with Terry. I'm a lawyer by training, and I'm particularly interested in federalism in the context of environment and natural resources.
Hi, my name is Atul Sood. I teach at the Center for Study of Regional Development at JNU.
I'm Mohammad Nasir. I'm Masters of Law student at Aligarh Muslim University. My areas of interest include inclusive governance and Panchayati Raj.
Hi, my name is Kanav and I'm just a law student.
Good morning everyone. I'm Sharanya Upadhyay. I'm from Geetam University, Visakhapatnam.
Morning, I'm Harsha. I'm a researcher with the Energy and Resources Institute.
Yeah, my name is Veena Agarwal. I'm also with Terry.
Thank you everybody and a very hearty welcome to all of you. Mr. B.G. Varghese.
I was asked to speak about Meghalaya. I broadened it to the northeast, but I should say broaden it further because we're discussing a variety of states. But I'm no expert in the issue of land rights. I'm a generalist, but I have some thoughts. And some of them are more concerned with the future than with the present. Because I think we shouldn't mortgage the future to the past. And I think we're in some danger of doing that sometimes, good intentions notwithstanding. Now, in the northeast, for the most parts, and in Meghalaya too, lands are owned by communities and by clans. In some places, as in Mizoram, there were chiefs, but they were not very popular, and one of the first acts of the new Mizoram government was to abolish the chiefs. But it's these community holdings and common and community holdings that dominates the scene. This is something which has been sought to be protected and in some senses regulated by the autonomous councils and other institutions in the northeast, of which Mr. Mohrmen will speak much more in detail and with greater knowledge. But these have not really worked very well in all respects. And in many parts of the northeast, land alienation has been going on apace for a variety of reasons. Outside settlers coming in as refugees, illegal immigrants for development work on roads, railways, dams, other projects. And this has led to the occupation of tribal lands, which are not well protected. In Assam, for instance, the tribal belts and blocks that were established because the plains tribals felt they were losing all their lands have now been reduced to about a third or half of what they were originally, and that's the origin, in a sense, or the driving force of the Bodo problem and so on. But this is all over the northeast and in the rest of the country too. Because one of the things you must remember is that the geography of India remains what it was in 47, but we've added 3 Indias to the population of India in 1950, and before population stabilizes another 30 or 40 years, we'd have added another 1 or 2 more Indias of the 1947 vintage in terms of numbers. Therefore, things cannot be the same. And therefore, to talk of traditional rights and what it was in my childhood, and my grandmother told me, etc., is all very interesting and anecdotal, but not necessarily relevant to the future. We mustn't forget that, and this does not mean we can be reckless, but we need to keep this thought in mind. The other thing that is happening in the Northeast is that because of development, roads, railways, dams, extension of agriculture, new townships, settlements, and so on and so forth, apart from this settlement and migrants and so on, this has led to a lot of loss of land. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing, because it's for the benefit of the people concerned. And land and livelihood have very little value unless you have access, communications. Therefore, to build these requires land, and somebody has to give that land. And in giving that land, you enhance the value of the land you possess. So it's not a one-way street, as we sometimes imagine. And I think these are factors that need to be kept in mind and studied and ensure that the proper balance is maintained. I think in all these matters, the important word is balance, not yes or no, but the right balance. And the balance is not a static one. It is dynamic, and it changes with time and with other circumstances. The other thing that's been happening in the Northeast is that lands that are owned by communities and by clans and so on and so forth, and these are supposedly protected, are being alienated by the population themselves. A new kind of sort of enclosure system, not exactly a parallel of what happened in Britain, in England, several centuries ago, but something akin to that is happening, with the result that people are appropriating land from common properties or from common ownership to individual holdings. And a new feudalism is rising in many parts of the Northeast. Some of these include the settlement of illegal immigrants. So on the one hand, the outsider and the illegal immigrant, most often thought of as a Bangladeshi, is inveighed against. At the same time, these people have been invited in to do to work as serfs, in a sense, of these new feudal lords. So we have a very peculiar development taking place there. And all these have changed the traditional pattern of land holdings and land systems and relationships between community and land and individual and land and so on and so forth. So it is in this dynamic context that one has to view the situation. In Meghalaya, for instance, it's a sort of, is it matriarchal or matrilineal? I always get mixed.
It's
yes,
lineal.
Lineal, yes, yes. I get mixed up. Women are supposed to be top dogs, but I'm not sure that they have the property rights that they are entitled to. This is all a good signboard status, but in reality, they don't have that. So that there's a gender aspect in many of these areas too. So I think the situation is not what it is on paper, and the sixth schedule has not been able to hold the ring in a sense. Some ways it's because of its own contradictions and laxities, but in other cases it's because it was helpless against the tide of events that took place. We need to review this and decide how we should move forward, and that is something that many people feel needs to be done, including a review of the sixth schedule or aspects of it. In other parts of the country, we have the fifth schedule. That again has been bypassed, and we have a strange situation where the Constitution says something, but the situation on the ground and the ground reality is very different. And nobody's concerned about this enormous contradiction, which needs to be taken note of. There again, there's cause for review. Now, the environmental aspect is important because in the Northeast, particularly in the hill areas, heavily forested, I think is the most well-endowed forest area of the country is in the Northeast, particularly in some of the hill states. But here again, jhumming, a traditional cultivation practice, which is agroforestry really in a sense, has changed in the sense that because the pressure of population and of some lands being taken up for development, the jhum cycle has steadily come down, with the result of there being a long cycle which gave time for regeneration before one returned to that same area. It's shrunk to under 10 years, 6 years, in some places even less, with the result that this has led to the abandonment of jhums, erosion, and large areas which are just barren patches. Now, one can say, therefore, traditional practices should be protected. And indeed, there's every reason to ensure that what is worthwhile in these traditional practices, the principle being agroforestry, should be maintained. But how do we cope with these changing needs and requirements is something that we need to think of. Therefore, again, I stress, our concern should be as much as safeguarding the future rather than living in the past and trying to go backwards, because there's no going backwards. One has to move forward, maintaining the right kind of balance. Then if you want to move from subsistence farming to market farming, as you must do if you want to improve livelihoods and get true value from the land that you possess, you've got to move to other crops. And the Northeast, for instance, is particularly well suited to plantation crops, horticulture, vegetables, floriculture, herbiculture, and so on and so forth, which are high value and can be done on small plots with small holders, rather than the kind of tea estates. Estates suggests vast areas, as you had in the tea gardens, and it really be done by smallholders, with economies of scale coming from cooperativization or communitization of these things, in collaboration with bigger agencies, whether the state or cooperativized or the corporate sector, to undertake the marketing, the technological services, and the branding, and so on and so forth. And there's nothing wrong with this kind of partnership. In fact, in an interesting example, in some of Arunachal, the tea gardens in Assam right up to the Arunachal border, and then Arunachal starts and you get steep slopes. But in some of the little areas which are suitable for tea gardening, smallholders in Arunachal have started growing tea. And they now are in association with the big plantations just across the border. Across the border means 200 yards away or a kilometer away, who provide them the technology and who buy their leaves and process them in their market in partnership with them, so that they are able to expand their production because they have no area in the Assam gardens to expand further. They had leases from an earlier period which have been frozen. They can't expand, but they get additional leaf for expansion of production through this kind of partnership. Now, this is an example. No one foisted it upon anybody. It just happened through a process of osmosis. And there was a mutual interest on both sides. So the technological services and the marketing and the production and branding are done by the big person, by the big corporate, in collaboration with a series or groups of smallholders. In Tripura, for instance, as part of the rehabilitation of insurgent groups and some refugees also, rubber plantations were taken up, and some very successful rubber cooperatives and tea cooperatives have been set up there. So that this aggregation can help, and that can be in collaboration with either the state, as in the case of, say, or semi-state bodies in the case of Amul or whatever, or in the case of the cooperative structures or public-private partnerships that we can have, as we have in parts of Assam. A very interesting experiment, not experiment, a program was launched in Nagaland about, 15, 20 years ago. I forget the initials, Nagaland Environmental Something Protection for Development, NEPED, I think it was called, to restore the scientific agroforestry content in jhum farming. And this was done through a process of having people grow trees on the boundaries of the jhum field, growing nitrogenous crops of various kinds that would fertilize the land, bringing in improved seeds and varieties, so that by the time you came back to the same plot in terms of your jhum cycle, the productivity of that land had been improved. Now, this has worked, and I think it is continuing. But you have other experiments where you have very advanced farming, as for instance in the Apatani Plateau, where in a very small area you have very, very elaborate systems of cropping and allocation of land for different purposes, and this has worked extremely well, and so on. But going to the future, I would say, I would feel a certain excessive nostalgia for land as it existed can be a danger and a menace to tribal societies itself. Because we're so concerned about protecting their past that we are mortgaging their future. And I, for instance, would argue the case that, for instance, POSCO is a good thing. Safeguarding the genuine interests in terms of rehabilitation, compensation, training, employment, and all the rest of it, but with committing, as POSCO has been committed and other corporates are committed, to spending a certain amount of money for corporate social responsibility, for the social development of that area. Something where in 1996, the Supreme Court, in a judgment dealing with the alienation of certain lands, tribal lands for mining from the state to the private party, in the Samta judgment, the Samta was that company, laid down parameters saying 20% of your profits, pre-tax, shall be plowed into social development. Since you are taking over the state's lands, you must take over that responsibility and build roads, schools, hospitals, provide water supply, and so on for those people. Now, systems of this kind can be brought to bear on ensuring that the tribal people, while giving up their land, are able to improve their livelihoods and their quality of life. This calls for, as I say, both balance and proper monitoring and supervision, so that there's no question of saying something and making false promises and running away from them. Much has been said about the environment in other cases. Again, in Meghalaya, you have community-held lands which the state cannot touch, where you have coal-bearing seams which are outcropping, and you have rat hole mining, which is an absolute disaster from the point of view of health, human rights, children being pushed into literally rat hoods to extract coal. It's wasteful, and this combustible material catches fire, spontaneous combustion. It plays havoc, and it dirties the environment all around. Now, this needs to be regulated, and I don't think that one can say that these are tribal rights. We should protect them. I think we ought to move beyond those parameters. Same thing with regard to dams. Now, I'm for dams, but I think good dams. There are bad dams which should not be built, or are good in their design but bad in their implementation, and they're dealing with the human aspects of it. We must take care of all of those. And it is true that in the earlier periods, we didn't understand these problems. We were on a learning curve, and there was neglect and exploitation and false promises of various kinds. But we have to move beyond that, and now we have to ensure, and we are beginning to ensure, that better parameters are set, whether it is for compensation in case of submergence for dams, or for industrial plants, or for mines, or whatever. So I think these are all very important aspects that we need to look at, so that we can not merely protect the tribal people, but improve their livelihoods and their state of health and education and everything else, and give them development. The example I'd quote, I mentioned Vedanta, and I close with that, is that because of their commitment under the law, under the new law, to spend a certain amount of their annual expenditure on social development, within the period of, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, they spent 170 crores for water supply, for roads, for markets, for resettlement in a nice colony of those limited number of people who were displaced, and so on and so forth. Self-help groups, which are making productive use of their natural resources, and so on. with the result that livelihoods have been created and standards of living have improved. Now, if you say, no, don't go there, leave them alone, what happens? They remain what Jawaharlal Nehru warned against. We must protect our tribal population, help them grow within their customary ways of thinking in accordance to their own genius and at their own pace. But we should not keep them as anthropological specimens and as museum pieces. I think with great goodwill we are sometimes doing that. Gandhamardan, which was another bauxite mine, to which we said no 20 years ago in Orissa, remains as it was. Conditions of health, education, access, absolutely pathetic. Is that what we want? And as I say, in this Vedanta mining area, in Niyamgiri, not in Niyamgiri, but in, I forget the name, but whatever it is, where the alumina plant is, they have, in the matter of less than 10 years, done more than the state of Orissa in 60 years. I think the record of the Orissa government in this is disgraceful. So what are we defending? So I would say that we've got to look at all these things in that particular context of rights, of environment, and of everything else that we are concerned about. I've wandered about and maundered along, but forgive me for that. But I thought I would bring in this issue of the future as much as the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. B.G. Varghese. That was well in time, actually. So now, Mr. Mohrmen. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Kavita, for the opportunity to be here, and thank Mr. Varghese for, calling me an expert. In fact, I'm not an expert. I'm just an activist who had been involved in the environmental protection for so many years. So that's about it. So what I'm going to talk about is also, on that aspect. And since I also belong to the to the tribal, I'm a tribal myself, and I live in a place where the district council is functioning, and this, like the title of the paper says, that it's it's a story about myself, and it's about where I come from with regards to mining. And let me start by going to the history of mining in the area. Like anywhere else, stone and quarrying, sand quarrying, and mining of limestone for making paints and for whitewashing, and for using the same space for consuming betel nuts and pan leaves were the earliest form of mining in the state. People extracted these minerals for local use, hence this practice can be categorized as traditional mining. But later on, industrial mining, of limestone, which is less than 10 years old. Although earlier there were 2 small cement plants in the state, but it was only very recently that mega cement plant came to set shop in the area. Mining of limestone for use in various cement plants was very recently, particularly in the East Giant Hills district of Meghalaya. The government does not consider the sustainability of the area, because it allows setting up of more than 8 cement plants and their captive power plant in an area of less than 5 kilometers radius. The area where the plants were set up was previously forested area, but forests were systematically cleared to enable the company to set up their plants. The areas where the cement plants are located are also very close to the Narpo Reserve Forest of Meghalaya, and the area will be less than 5 kilometers by radius from the reserve forest. Mining of limestone for export to Bangladesh is also of a very recent origin. This particular mining is being done by native people, the tribal people, particularly the people in the Giant Hills, for export of the same to Bangladesh. And mining on the Indo-Bangladesh border, particularly in the Nongtalang and Penorsla area, was carried out with total disregard to the national mining and forest law. Forest was cleared without any consideration, and mining was done at whims and fancy of the mine owners. The tribal of the areas, on the pretext that they own the land, also feels that they can do whatever they like because the land belongs to them. So the rampant destruction of environment is because of this tribal misconception of the land tenure system. Although in the pre-independence period, in the area like Wapung and Chermang, these are village near to Joai, the district headquarters of West Giant Hills, they used to mine coal at a